What if the strangest thing buried beneath the Grand Canyon isn't a treasure at all? What if it's a doorway? And what if the people who say it's down there, who have been saying it quietly and consistently for something like 1,000 years, never once use the words gold, or Egypt, or mummy, or cover-up? What if they've been telling us the whole time, in plain language, in public testimony, in tribal council chambers and federal hearings and courtrooms, and almost nobody has been listening, because the story they tell isn't the story we wanted? Here's what I mean. In 1909, a newspaper in Phoenix, Arizona, printed a front-page story about a cavern in the canyon wall filled with mummies and hieroglyphs and idols that looked like the Buddha. That story is still circulating today, more than 115 years later. It has millions of views. It has documentaries. It has a whole industry. And it appears to be entirely made up. Meanwhile, about 4 miles up the Little Colorado River from where it pours into the Colorado, there's a dome of yellow stone about 30 feet across, shaped a little like an enormous beehive, with a pool of mineral water sitting in a depression at the top. It is real. You can find it on a map. It has been visited, continuously, for centuries, and the Hopi people say it is the place where their ancestors came up out of a previous world into this one, and that the world they came from is still down there, still occupied, still connected to this one every single day. So, one of those two stories is a hoax, and one of them is a religion older than most of the cathedrals of Europe. And tonight, you and I are going to take our time and walk through both of them. And I want to be honest with you about one more thing. There are parts of Hopi belief that are not mine to tell, and not yours to know, and that isn't a tease, it's simply true. The Hopi have been extremely clear, for well over a century, about which parts of their knowledge belong to the world, and which parts belong only to the initiated, to particular clans, to particular kivas, to particular ceremonies. So everything I tell you tonight comes from what Hopi people have themselves chosen to make public. Testimony given to Congress, interviews given to reporters, statements from the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, published accounts written or authorized by Hopi people themselves. There's a certain kind of story about ancient secrets that treats sacred knowledge as loot, as something to be dug up and displayed. I don't want to tell that story. I want to tell you the better one, which, as it turns out, is also the true one. So let's begin somewhere very simple. Let's begin with the hole in the ground. Because before there were any stories about it at all, there was just a river and a great deal of time. Picture it with me, slowly. You're standing on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, near a place called Grandview Point, and it's the middle of the night. There's no moon. This is important. The canyon at night in the dark of the moon is not a view, it's an absence. It is the largest nothing you will ever stand in front of. You know, something enormous is out there because the stars stop at a certain line, and below that line, there is simply no light at all, in any direction, for as far as you can turn your head. And then, a breeze comes up out of it, and it's cool, and it smells faintly of wet stone and juniper, and you realize that the air moving past your face has come up more than a mile from the bottom of the world. That's the first thing to understand about this place. It is not a valley. A valley is something you look across. This is something you look down into, and the scale of it does something strange to the human brain, something that has been documented over and over in the writings of the first Europeans who saw it, who were, almost without exception, unable to describe it accurately. So subscribe and let's get started. The numbers, for what they're worth, about 277 miles long, following the river, up to 18 miles across at its widest. About a mile deep on average, from rim to river, though it varies. And underneath all of that, a river that at flood stage before the dams could move something like 300,000 cubic feet of water per second. But numbers don't really do it. Here's what does. If you walk from the rim down to the river, down the Bright Angel Trail, say, which takes most people the better part of a day, you are walking through roughly 1.5 billion years of the Earth's history, and you're doing it with your feet. Every band of color in that wall is a different world that existed and then ended. Near the top, you're walking through the Kaibab limestone, which was the bottom of a warm, shallow sea about 270 million years ago, full of sponges and brachiopods and shark teeth. A little further down, you cross the Coconino Sandstone, which is a fossilized desert, an ocean of sand dunes the size of a small country, and you can still see the slanting lines of the dune faces frozen in the rock, and here and there the small climbing tracks of reptiles that crossed those dunes and left footprints in the wet sand of a morning about 265 million years ago. Sit with that for a second. A creature walked up a sand dune one morning. It has been that morning ever since. Further down, the Redwall limestone, 350 million years old, a sheer cliff 500 feet high, stained red by iron washing down from the layers above it, honeycombed with caves. Remember the caves. We'll come back to them, because that's where the real buried things are. And then, near the bottom, past all of it, you come to something that doesn't look like the rest at all. Dark, twisted, glittering rock, the Vishnu schist. It's around 1.7 billion years old. It was once the roots of a mountain range that has been completely erased. It has been buried, cooked, folded, uplifted, and stripped, and it is so much older than everything above it that between the schist and the layer sitting directly on top of it, there is a gap in the record of somewhere around 1 billion years. Geologists call it the Great Unconformity, 1 billion years of Earth history that simply isn't there, missing, eroded away before the next layer began. There is a missing 1 billion years in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. That's not mysticism. That's a fact you can put your hand on. And here's the thing I want you to hold on to, because it's going to matter later. A place like this does something to human beings. It is so far outside the scale of a life, or a village, or a lineage, that it seems to demand explanation. It seems to be about something. Every group of people who has ever stood at that rim has felt the pull to fill that space with meaning, and what they filled it with tells you almost nothing about the canyon, and almost everything about them. Which brings us to a very small newspaper office in Phoenix in the spring of 1909. Phoenix in 1909 was not the city it is now. Arizona wasn't even a state yet. It wouldn't be admitted to the Union until February of 1912. It was a territory, dusty and ambitious, and Phoenix was a town of a few thousand people, with irrigation canals, saloons, a streetcar line, and several newspapers, competing hard for a very small pool of readers. One of them was the Arizona Gazette, an evening paper. And on Monday, the 5th of April, 1909, The Gazette ran a story across the top of its front page under a stack of headlines that read, in the fashion of the time, like a man shouting down a hallway, "Explorations in Grand Canyon. Mysteries of immense high cavern being brought to light. Jordan is enthused. Remarkable finds indicate ancient people migrated from Orient." Now, let's take this slowly, because the details matter, and because the way this story is built is genuinely a small work of art. The article says that a man named G.E. Kincaid had come into the city the previous day with news. Kincaid, it says, was an explorer and hunter, the first white child born in Idaho, and a man who had spent 30 years in the service of the Smithsonian Institute. He had, some months earlier, traveled from Green River, Wyoming, all the way down the Colorado in a wooden boat, alone, to Yuma, an extraordinary claim in itself, a solo run through the worst white water on the continent. And on that journey, high up on the canyon wall, he had seen something, stains on the rock. He climbed to it, and he found a cut opening in the cliff face, and behind the opening, a passage running back into the stone. The passage, according to the story, ran hundreds of feet into the rock. Off it opened chamber after chamber, several hundred rooms, one corridor explored for 854 feet, another for 634. Not a natural cave. Hewn, cut by human hands with square corners and finished walls. And in those rooms, copper weapons, hardened somehow to an edge like steel, urns and vessels of a yellow metal, granaries still holding seeds, tablets covered in hieroglyphs, mummies wrapped in a dark fabric, laid out in tiers, hundreds of them, the men tall, the tallest of them well over 6 feet. And in a chamber at the heart of it, seated cross-legged holding a lotus flower, an idol that the explorer said resembled the Buddha. The article gives the location, sort of. It says the entrance is 1,486 feet down a sheer canyon wall, some 42 miles up the river from a place it calls El Tovar, Crystal Canyon. It says the site is on government land, and then, and this is the detail that has done more work than every other detail in the piece combined. It says that no visitor will be allowed there under penalty of trespass, because the scientists wish to work unmolested. Sit with that for a moment. In one sentence, the article creates a discovery that will rewrite human history, and then it locks the door and tells you that you personally are forbidden to go and check. The story goes on. It says that the Smithsonian is financing the work. It says a professor named S.A. Jordan is leading the excavation and is enthusiastic. It says 30 or 40 people will be brought in to expand the dig. And it ends with a flourish that, honestly, no working journalist could write today without laughing. A line about how Egypt and the Nile, and Arizona and the Colorado will be linked by a chain of history running back into ages that stagger the wildest imagination of any novelist. That's the story. That's the whole seed. One newspaper article in a territorial evening paper on a Monday. And here's the part that I find genuinely fascinating, and that I think is worth staying with for a while, because it's the real mystery of the night. Not what's in the cave, but why this particular story refused to die when 100,000 other newspaper tall tales from that same decade died quietly and were forgotten. The first reason is that it was extremely well constructed. Whoever wrote it knew exactly what they were doing. Think about what the piece does. It doesn't just say treasure, it attaches itself to institutions. The Smithsonian is named, not the Smithsonian Institution Note, but the Smithsonian Institute, which is not the organization's name and never has been, and which is exactly the kind of error a person makes when they're writing about an institution from a distance rather than from inside it. It names a professor. It gives specific measurements, 854 feet, not about 800. Specificity is the oldest trick in the forger's book because the human mind treats precision as a proxy for truth. And it gives a reason you can't verify it, which converts the absence of evidence into further evidence. That's a self-sealing story. Every attempt to check it becomes part of it. But there's a second reason it survived, and this one is stranger and much older, and it's genuinely the more interesting half of the puzzle. The 1909 article landed in a canyon that had already, for nearly 30 years, been officially covered in Egyptian and Hindu and Buddhist names by the United States government. I'm not exaggerating. Open a topographic map of the Grand Canyon right now and look at the buttes: Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, Cheops Pyramid, the Tower of Set, the Tower of Ra, Horus Temple, Shiva Temple, Vishnu Temple, Brahma Temple, Zoroaster Temple, Krishna Shrine, Buddha Temple, Buddha Cloister, Manu Temple, Deva Temple, Rama Shrine, Confucius Temple. Now, if you are a person who reads that 1909 article and then looks at that map, what conclusion are you being handed on a plate? You're being handed the idea that somebody at some point knew, that the names are a record, that the government mapped an Egyptian ruin and then quietly buried the fact, but couldn't quite scrub the labels. So, where did those names actually come from? They came from a man named Clarence Edward Dutton, and he is one of the great forgotten characters of American science, and I want to spend a little time with him, because he's exactly the kind of person this story keeps producing. Dutton was born in Connecticut in 1841. He went to Yale at 15, and he studied theology for a while, and then the Civil War happened, and he ended up in the Union Army and stayed in the Ordnance Corps afterward. He was, by all accounts, a very funny man, a heavy smoker, a compulsive reader, and possessed of a prose style so lush that modern geologists still quote him for pleasure. And in the 1870s he was detailed to work with John Wesley Powell, the one-armed veteran who had run the canyon in 1869, and Dutton went out to the Colorado Plateau and fell completely, permanently in love with it. In 1882 he published his masterpiece, a government monograph with the extremely unromantic title, Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District. And it is not written like a government monograph. It's written like a man in a state of religious astonishment, trying to keep his voice steady. Dutton had a problem, and it was a naming problem. He was mapping dozens of enormous isolated buttes standing in the middle of the canyon, structures the size of mountains, each one distinct, and they needed names, and he refused, flatly refused, to name them after congressmen and surveyors and mining investors, which is what was being done everywhere else in the American West. He thought these things deserved better. He thought the architecture of them, the terraces, the stepped platforms, the towers, genuinely resembled the great temple complexes of Asia, which he knew from engravings and from his own wide reading in comparative religion. So he named them after the gods. All the gods. He was ecumenical about it. Vishnu and Shiva and Brahma, Isis and Osiris and Ra, Buddha and Zoroaster and Confucius. He was not recording anything. He was not encoding a secret. He was a Victorian aesthete with a theology degree and a poetic streak, standing in front of the most astonishing landscape he had ever seen, reaching for the biggest words he had. And the names stuck. Later, surveyors added more in the same vein. The U.S. Board on Geographic Names made them official. Shiva Temple, for instance, was formally adopted in 1906, 3 years before the Gazette story ran. So, by 1909, the map of the Grand Canyon looked like a lost pantheon, for reasons that were entirely about one man's reading habits. And along came an article about Egyptian mummies in a hidden cave, and the two things locked together like a key in a lock. And here's where things get properly strange. Because that link, the map and the article, was not really made in 1909. In 1909, the story ran, and then, as far as anyone has been able to determine, essentially nothing happened. No follow-up, no retraction either, but no follow-up. No other paper picked it up in any serious way. The Gazette itself apparently never mentioned it again. The greatest archaeological discovery in the history of the United States was announced on a Monday, and then, seemingly, everyone involved went to lunch and forgot about it forever. Think about how odd that is. If you had actually found several hundred rooms of mummies in a cliff, the story would not simply stop. There would be photographs. The article even claims photographs were taken and sent east. There would be a second dispatch. There would be a scramble from every other paper in the territory, all of whom would have loved nothing better than to scoop the Gazette on the biggest story in Arizona history. Instead, silence for decades. The article was pulled back out of the microfilm much later, really taking hold in the last few decades of the 20th century, in the era of paperback books about lost civilizations, and then detonating completely with the arrival of the Internet, where a scan of a 100-year-old front page is the single most persuasive-looking object in the world. It looks like evidence. It has the typography of truth. And when people did go and ask the Smithsonian about it, which they have now done in large numbers for years, the answer has been consistent and boring, which is generally how you can tell an answer is real. The institution's anthropology department reports that it has no records of a G.E. Kincaid, no records of a Professor S.A. Jordan connected to any such work, no records of any Grand Canyon expedition matching the account, and no Egyptian artifacts ever recovered from anywhere in North or South America by the Smithsonian. It has become such a recurring question that the institution has effectively had to keep a standing answer on file. Librarians have looked. Park historians have looked. The Grand Canyon Historical Society has published on it. Independent researchers have gone through the newspaper archives, the census records, the expedition rosters, and the two men at the center of it, the explorer and the professor, appear to be no one, not misidentified, not renamed, not covered up, simply absent from the record in a way that real people, in 1909 America, a country with censuses and city directories and land offices and pension rolls, almost never are. There's even a tell in the spelling. Across the coverage, the explorer's name flickers between Kincaid and Kincaid. Real people generally have one spelling of their name in print. Characters have as many as the typesetter feels like. So, what actually happened in that newspaper office? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, and I'd rather tell you that than invent a tidy ending. But the most likely explanation is depressingly ordinary. The first decade of the 20th century was the absolute golden age of the newspaper hoax. It was a recognized genre. Papers ran fabricated marvels. Sea serpents, petrified giants, lost cities, men who could fly, partly to fill space, partly to sell copies, and partly, one suspects, for the pure fun of it. Journalism as a profession had not yet grown the immune system it has now. There were men in that era who became locally famous for inventing stories and feeding them to papers, and their names come up whenever historians pick at 1909. It may have been a slow Monday. It may have been a booster's attempt to drum up tourism for a territory desperate to become a state. It may have been one bored reporter with a good ear and a long afternoon. What it almost certainly was not was true. And I want to be careful here, because I don't want to be sneering about it. There is nothing stupid about being drawn to that story. It's a wonderful story. Rooms cut into a cliff, a seated figure with a lotus, a chamber of the dead. That's a beautiful image, and the desire behind it is one of the most human desires there is. The desire for the world to be older, deeper, and stranger than we were told. The thing is, in this particular place, the world genuinely is older, deeper, and stranger than most people were told. It's just that the real version doesn't involve Egyptians. It involves people who are still here. Before we cross over, though, let's deal with the last brick in the wall, because the modern version of the 1909 story has an extra piece that the 1909 story never had, and it's worth taking apart while we're here. The modern version says that the whole region of the canyon containing those Egyptian and Hindu names is a forbidden zone. Closed, off-limits, patrolled, no one allowed in. It's a great line. It's also not how the Grand Canyon works. That country, the area around Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, Cheops Pyramid, Shiva Temple, is inside Grand Canyon National Park, and it is backcountry, which means it's remote, waterless, brutally difficult, and requires a permit, exactly like backcountry everywhere else in the national park system. It is not sealed. People go there. Climbers go there. Researchers go there. The reason you don't see crowds on the summit of Isis Temple is not a government cordon. It's that getting up there involves several days of route binding through cliff bands with everything you need to drink on your back. And we know people have gone up there because of one of my favorite episodes in the whole history of this place, which happened in September of 1937, and which is, I promise you, a real event with real newspaper coverage. The American Museum of Natural History in New York decided to mount an expedition to the top of Shiva Temple. Their reasoning was actually rather elegant. Shiva Temple is an enormous flat-topped butte, a couple of 100 acres of ponderosa pine forest on its summit, and it stands detached from the north rim, separated by a deep saddle. The theory was that this was a biological island, that when erosion cut it off from the mainland at the end of the last ice age, the animals living on top were marooned there, and that in the tens of thousands of years since, they might have evolved into something new, a lost world, a mile in the air, in the middle of Arizona. The press absolutely loved it. It got called the Lost World Expedition. The Los Angeles Times ran daily dispatches. It was led by Dr. Harold Elmer Anthony, the curator of mammals at the museum, and it had climbers and packers out of Utah, and a woman named Amy Andrews who flew a Stinson airplane over the summit and parachuted supplies down to the scientists, eggs, water, food, with one of the 5 drops breaking loose, and, in the words of one participant, crashing with extraordinary thoroughness onto the top of the butte. And when Anthony and his team got up there, sweating and triumphant onto the untrodden summit that no human being had supposedly ever set foot on in the history of the world, they found deer antlers, the remains of ancestral Puebloan structures, because of course native people had been up there centuries before and had built things. And, sitting on the ground, an empty Kodak film box. It had been left about a month earlier by Emery Kolb. Kolb was a photographer who had lived on the South Rim since 1904, who, with his brother Ellsworth, had run the entire canyon by boat in 1911 and 1912 and filmed it, and who then showed that film to tourists at his studio on the Rim, several times a day, for something like 60 years. He knew the canyon better than almost anyone alive. And when he heard that a party of New Yorkers was coming out to be the first humans on Shiva Temple, he went up with his daughter Edith and 3 friends, and he left a film box on the summit where they couldn't miss it. I love that story. I love it because it's the whole thing in miniature. Somebody announces a sealed, untouched, forbidden place, and it turns out the locals have been going there for years, and the people before them had been going there for centuries, and there's litter. The scientists incidentally found chipmunks, rock squirrels, pack rats, mice, and cottontails, all of which were exactly the same as the chipmunks and squirrels and rats and mice and cottontails on the Rim. No new species. Time magazine ran a piece about the whole affair, under a headline about a treasureless island. It was, scientifically, a bust, and it's one of the best stories the canyon has. So, no forbidden zone, no sealed cavern, no Egyptians. And now let's turn the lamp the other way. Because the question that title asks, what is still buried beneath the Grand Canyon, has an answer, a real one. It's just that to hear it, you have to stop asking the canyon and start asking the people whose ancestors have been living in it, and beside it, and on the mesas above it, for a length of time that makes 1909 look like this morning. Roughly 70 miles east of the canyon's south rim, the land rises into a long, dark tableland called Black Mesa, and off the southern edge of that mesa run 3 narrow fingers of rock. On top of those fingers sit the villages of the Hopi. They have names, and you should hear them, because they're beautiful. On First Mesa, Walpi, Sitsomavi, Tewa Village. On Second Mesa, Sangupavi, Musangnuvi, Supaulavi. On Third Mesa, Oraivi, Kikotsmovi, Hotvela, Pakavi, and down below, Munkapi. Walpi sits on a spine of stone so narrow that in places the village is the width of a single house with a 500-foot drop on either side, and from up there you can see 100 miles. And Oraivi, Old Oraibi, is generally described as one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America, with occupation documented from around the year 1100. Think about what that means for a second. When people were building the first stone houses at Oraivi, the Norman conquest of England was a recent event. The First Crusade was underway. Notre Dame de Paris had not been started. Genghis Khan had not been born. And people have been living there and farming corn in the sand below without interruption ever since. Now, the Hopi word for the Grand Canyon is Ungtupka. It means, more or less, salt canyon. And that one word is the thread that unravels everything, because it tells you immediately that this is not a scenic feature to the Hopi. It's not a view. It's a working landscape with a purpose, a destination, a place you go to get something. Salt. And, as we'll see, a great deal more than salt. The Hopi are not visitors to this story. They're not adjacent to it. Ungtupka is, in the most literal sense the words will carry, where they say they came from. So let's slow right down now, and let me tell you the story of the emergence, carefully and with the honesty it deserves about where these words come from. Every Hopi village, every clan, holds its own version of this history, and they differ. They differ in emphasis, in detail, in which clan did what and arrived when. This is not a flaw in the tradition, it's the structure of it. There is no single Hopi scripture, no fixed text, no council that ratified an official edition. The knowledge lives in people, in clans, in ceremonial societies, and it is told at the proper time by the proper person, which means that everything written down in English by outsiders is at best a partial photograph of something living. The version most widely circulated in English comes from a book published in 1963 called Book of the Hopi, written by a novelist named Frank Waters in collaboration with a Hopi man from Oribe, Oswald Whitebear Fredericks, who did much of the interpreting and gathered many of the informants. That book put the four worlds with their names into the general culture, and if you have ever heard anything about Hopi prophecy, it almost certainly traces back to it. And I have to tell you plainly, many Hopi people regard that book as unreliable, and its publication as improper. The objection is partly that Waters was a poetic outsider shaping the material to his own vision, partly that some of what appears in it was not his or anyone's to publish, and partly that a single book by a single author was received by the outside world as the voice of an entire people, which it is not. So when I use the names of the worlds, I'm using them the way you'd use a translation of a translation. They're a handhold, not the thing itself. With that said, here is the shape of it, and the shape is what matters. This is not the first world. That's the beginning of everything. Before this world, there were others, and in each of them, human beings began well and then went wrong, and each time the world had to end. The first world was endless space, and there was nothing in it but the mind of the Creator. And then there was a first being made to carry out the plan, and then there was earth and water and air, and finally there were people, formed from clay and given breath, and given the ability to speak and told to remember. That's the whole instruction. Remember who made you. Remember the songs. Live in a way that keeps the world in balance. And for a long while they did. And then some of them stopped. The way the tellings usually put it, the forgetting doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual and social. People begin to notice differences between each other. They begin to trade in a grasping way rather than a generous way. They begin to laugh at the ones who still sing the old songs. And eventually the ceremonies stop being performed properly, and the balance goes, and the world becomes unlivable. Not as a punishment exactly, but the way a house becomes unlivable when nobody maintains it. So, the first world was destroyed by fire, volcanoes, and rain that burned. But before it ended, the ones who had not forgotten were led away and hidden. And this is the detail I want you to hold on to because it recurs, and it's the beating heart of everything we're talking about tonight. They were led underground. In the tellings, they were taken down into the earth, into the homes of the ant people, who fed them and sheltered them and kept them alive while the surface burned, and who, in most versions, tightened their own belts and went hungry so the guests could eat, which is where the ants get their narrow waists. Isn't that lovely? A whole cosmology, and it stops to explain the shape of an ant. And when the surface was ready again, they came up out of the ground into the second world. The second world was good, and it lasted a long time. People built villages and traded. And then, once again, it went wrong in exactly the same way. Comfort, then greed, then contempt for the ones still doing the ceremonies. And the second world was ended, too, in most versions by cold. The world tipped, or spun off its proper course, and ice came down over everything, and the world froze solid. And again, the ones who remembered were led underground to the ant people. And again, they waited, and again they came up, into the third world. Now the third world is the interesting one. The third world is the one people always want to talk about, and I understand why. Because in the third world, the tellings say, the people multiplied enormously and built great cities, and they became technologically formidable. There are descriptions in the published versions of shields that flew through the air, and of one city making war on another from the sky. You can see immediately why a certain kind of reader has seized on that. But I'd ask you to notice what the story actually does with it, because it's not a story about technology at all. In every version, the sin of the third world is not invention. It's that the people use their power for corruption and war. And again, the ceremonies stopped. And again, the ones who kept the songs became a hunted minority. And the third world was destroyed by water, a flood covering everything. And here is the part that matters for tonight. The escape works differently. The faithful were not taken down to the ant people. This time they were sealed inside hollow reeds and set adrift on the flood, and they floated for a long time, coming to island after island, and each island was smaller and poorer than the last, until finally they came to the end of the water, and there was nowhere left to go but up. They had been traveling east all this time, and Spider Grandmother, Kokyang Wuti, who runs through Hopi tradition as helper, guide, and a voice of practical wisdom, told them that there was another world above this one, a fourth world, and that above them, somewhere in the sky of their world, there was an opening. So they planted a pine tree to grow up and pierce the ceiling. It wasn't tall enough. They planted a reed, and the reed grew and grew, and it went up through the sky of the third world and out. They sent birds up first to scout, in different tellings a swallow, a dove, a hawk, and each flew as high as it could and came back exhausted, having found nothing. And finally the catbird went and flew all the way through the opening and came back and said, "There is a world up there. It's empty. There's one being there, and I've spoken to him, and he says you may come." And so they climbed. Try to see it. A reed rising out of an ocean, and up its length, one behind another, an entire people climbing hand over hand out of a drowned world, carrying seeds, carrying children, carrying the things they would need, climbing for a long, long time in the dark inside the stalk. And they came out through a hole in the ground. That hole is the Sipapuni. And they came up into a world that was at first cold and dark and unfinished, and standing at the opening was a figure waiting for them. Maso is not an easy figure to summarize, and I'm going to be careful here. He is the guardian and caretaker of this world, the fourth world. He is associated with fire, with the night, and with death. In many tellings he is fearsome to look at, and he is the being who receives the dead. He owns this world, and he permits people to live on it. He met them at the opening, and he offered them a choice. In front of him he had laid out ears of corn of different sizes and colors, long, beautiful, full ears, and one short, stubby blue one, and the different groups came up and chose, and the quickest and the proudest took the longest and finest ears. And what was left was the short blue ear, and the people who took it accepted a hard, small, difficult life. Masa gave them 4 things: a planting stick, a bag of seeds, a gourd of water, and the instruction to be humble. And he told them, in effect, "You may live here with me, but this world is mine. Live modestly, take care of the earth, do the ceremonies, and complete your migrations. If you do that, you'll be all right." That's the covenant. And it is not a covenant of comfort. It's very explicitly a covenant of difficulty. The short blue ear of corn, the dry land, the uncertain rain. There's a strain in Hopi thought that runs all the way through history, right up to modern testimony in Congress, that says we were given a hard place on purpose, because a hard place keeps you praying. If the corn came up without effort, you would forget who makes it come up. Now, there's one more piece of the emergence story, and it's the one that answers the question in our title more directly than anything else. So let's take it slowly. Not everyone who came up the reed should have come up. In the tellings, a sorcerer, a powaka, a person who works against the community for their own power, slipped up through the opening hidden among the good people. And nobody knew until the child of one of the leaders sickened and died. And there was terrible grief and then anger, because death was not supposed to have followed them into the new world. So the leader made a small ball of cornmeal and threw it into the air, and it came down on the head of the sorcerer. And there she was, exposed. And they were going to throw her back down the hole. And she said, "Wait, look down." And they looked back down through the opening into the world they had just left. And there, below them, they saw the dead child, alive, playing perfectly well in the world beneath. And the sorcerer said, in effect, "This is how it works now. The dead are not gone. They go down into the world below, and they live there. And so they let her stay, because you cannot have this world without the other one under it." Now stop for a moment and let that settle, because we've arrived somewhere important. What the Hopi say is beneath the Grand Canyon is not a treasure chamber. It's the previous world, and it is not empty, and it is not a ruin, and it is not the past. It is where the dead are. Every Hopi person who dies goes down there. The world below is understood as continuous with this one and simultaneous with it. A place where the seasons run opposite to ours, where the dead live and farm and hold their own ceremonies. And the traffic runs both ways. The dead come back as clouds, as rain, bringing moisture to the fields of the living. That is not a metaphor stretched thin for poetry. In Hopi thought, the clouds that pile up over the mesas in July and break in the afternoon are the ancestors returning, and when you pray for rain, you're praying to people you knew. Think about what that does to a landscape. If you believe that, then the canyon isn't scenery, and it isn't a resource. It is the threshold of your family home, the place where the doorway is. And the doorway is not symbolic. It has coordinates. Here's where it is. Come down out of the sky with me, slowly, and look at the eastern end of the Grand Canyon. The Colorado comes down out of Glen Canyon Dam through Lee's Ferry and enters a narrowing gorge called Marble Canyon, and it runs south, and the walls climb up around it. 600 feet, then 1,000, then 2,000, until the river is running in a slot of red wall limestone. And about 61 miles downstream from Lee's Ferry, another river comes in from the east out of its own gorge and joins it. That's the Little Colorado. In Hopi, it's associated with a whole region called Palavayu, the Redwater Country, And for most of the year, the lower stretch of it does something that people find difficult to believe when they see a photograph. It runs a bright, opaque, milky turquoise, almost the color of a swimming pool, or of copper oxide, or of certain glacier lakes, except this is the desert. The reason is that far up the gorge, a huge volume of water comes out of the ground at Blue Spring and other springs. Water that has been traveling underground through limestone for a long time, and it is absolutely saturated with dissolved calcium carbonate. When it hits the air, the mineral starts coming out of solution, hanging in the water as fine particles that scatter light, and building up on the riverbed in terraces and dams and shelves of travertine. So the water is blue for the same reason it is slowly turning itself into stone. Now, walk up that turquoise river from the confluence. It's slow-going, boulders and travertine ledges and pools, and after roughly 3.5 to 4.5 miles, on the eastern bank at the base of the gorge wall, you come to a dome. It's about 30 feet across and perhaps 20 feet high, almost perfectly rounded, ochre and yellow and cream-colored. And it is not a boulder. It grew there. It's a spring dome, the accumulated deposit of a mineral spring that has been laying down travertine for an unknown but very long time, building itself up layer on layer like a slow fountain casting itself in stone. At the top there's a depression, and in the depression there's water, and the water moves. Gas rises through it and the surface stirs. This is the Sipapuni, and I want you to hold both things in your mind at once, because I think holding both is the whole art of listening to a story like this. To a geologist, this is a travertine dome over a carbon dioxide-charged spring, and every part of it is explicable. To the Hopi, this is the opening. This is where the reed came through. This is the navel of the world, the place their ancestors climbed out of the flood, and the place their dead go back down. Neither of those descriptions damages the other. They're just two different questions being asked of the same object. The Sipapuni is a restricted place. It is not somewhere to go. The Hopi have asked, repeatedly and formally, that people not visit it, not photograph it, not treat it as a destination, and I'd ask you to sit with that request rather than around it. If you ever find yourself in that gorge, the right thing to do is stay away from it. But the Sipapuni does not sit alone. It sits on a road. The Hopi Salt Trail is one of the oldest human routes in the American Southwest that is still remembered by the people who made it. It comes down off the rim country to the east and drops into a side canyon. Salt Trail Canyon, a steep gash a few miles long that meets the Little Colorado Gorge from the east, and the descent is something like 4,000 feet, on a route that is in places a scrambled down broken ledges, and in places nothing but a line of small cairns left by people who came before you. And then the trail goes downriver, past the Sipapuni, to the confluence, and beyond the confluence to salt deposits in the Colorado's gorge below. Now, a salt journey sounds like an errand. It wasn't. Salt is genuinely valuable in a desert agricultural society, yes, and the Hopi did carry it back in loads. But the Salt Trail was a pilgrimage, and it was an initiation, and it was, in the most direct sense possible, a journey down into the land of the dead. Because that's where you were going. That gorge is where Masa's country begins. Somewhere down there, in Hopi geography, lies Maski, the skeleton house, the house of the dead. The salt itself is associated with a deity, Salt Woman, and taking it is not gathering, it's asking. So a young man who made that journey was walking alive into the place he would one day go dead. He was doing it as a rite of passage, usually with older men who had done it before, and he was carrying prayer offerings, pahos, prayer sticks with feathers, to leave at specific places along the way. Shrines, springs. The route is dense with them. We have first-hand accounts of this from Hopi men themselves. The best known comes from Don Taliesva, a man from Oraivi, whose life story was published in 1942 under the title Sun Chief, a remarkable book, one of the great autobiographies of the 20th century in any culture, and one which Taliesva narrated himself over years to a Yale researcher named Leo Simmons. In it, he describes making the salt journey with older relatives, the preparation, the fasting and instruction beforehand, the seriousness of it, the fear. And what comes off the page is not mysticism. It's the texture of an enormously difficult trip made by people who took it seriously. The heat, the weight, the exhaustion of climbing back out with a load of salt on your back up 4,000 feet of broken rock. The specific instructions about what to say and not say, and where to stop and what to leave. That's the thing that gets lost in the Mummies and Tunnels version of this canyon. The real underground story of the Grand Canyon isn't a hidden vault. It's a road, walked by named men in living memory, with rules. And the doorway at the end of that road got copied, deliberately, into every Hopi village. If you've ever seen a photograph of a kiva, the ceremonial chamber of the Pueblo peoples, you'll have noticed that you enter it from above. There's a ladder coming up out of a hole in the roof, and you climb down it into a rectangular room sunk into the earth. That in itself is the point. You descend out of this world into an underground room to conduct the business of the other one. And in the floor of that room, usually toward one end, there is a small hole, sometimes lined, sometimes plugged with a wooden stopper, sometimes just a shallow depression. That's the sipapu, named for the sipapuni. It is a scale model of the opening. So every kiva in every village is in a sense a portable canyon. It reproduces the geometry of the emergence, the world below, the opening, the ladder, the climb up into the light. And every time someone climbs down that ladder to prepare for a ceremony, they're re-entering the third world. And every time they climb back out into the daylight of the plaza, they're emerging again. Let that settle over you for a second, because it's an astonishing piece of religious architecture. Most religions build upward toward the sky. This one builds a hole in the floor and remembers where it came from, and the whole system points back down the Little Colorado to a yellow dome of travertine with water moving in the top of it. So, what is still buried beneath the Grand Canyon? To the Hopi, the answer is the world before this one, the road that connects to it, the ancestors who live there now, and the rain they send back. But that's the answer from the inside. There's another answer from the outside, from archaeology, from carbon dating, from patient people with trowels. And this is the part that I find most quietly astonishing. Because the physical evidence, gathered independently by people who are not trying to prove anything about anyone's religion, describes a human presence in that canyon so deep and so long that it makes the 1909 story look not just false, but small. Let's go down into the caves, 31.5 miles below Lee's Ferry, in Marble Canyon, there's an opening in the Redwall limestone, about 140 feet above the river. It's a big cave. You could park a couple of buses in the entrance chamber, and it faces out over the water, and you can see it from a boat if you know to look. It's called Stanton's Cave, and the way it got that name is a story worth telling on its own, because it's the perfect illustration of what this canyon does to confident men. In 1889, a group of investors in Denver had a plan. The idea was to build a railroad along the Colorado River, a water-level route from Colorado to the Gulf of California, running right down through the Grand Canyon, hauling coal. On paper, in an office, it's not insane. Water-level grades are what railroad engineers dream about. The president of the company was a man named Frank Mason Brown, and the chief engineer was Robert Brewster Stanton, and in the spring of that year they set out to survey the route by boat. They were, to put it kindly, under-equipped. The boats were thin, brittle cedar, built for speed rather than for being smashed against rocks. And Brown, this is the detail that has haunted the story for 130-odd years, decided against bringing life preservers. Too heavy, too much bulk. On the 10th of July, 12 miles into Marble Canyon, at Soap Creek Rapid, Brown's boat flipped in a whirlpool below the wave train. He came up once. The water took him under, and he did not come up again, and his body was never recovered. Stanton, shattered, kept going. 5 days later, 2 more men, Peter Hansbrough and Henry Richards, drowned in another rapid about 25 miles in. And Stanton did something that tells you exactly what kind of man he was. He hauled all the surviving equipment up the cliff and put it in a cave, that cave, and sealed it up, and walked his surviving crew out of the canyon up a side route, and went home to Denver. And then he came back, in the winter, with proper boats, oak and watertight, with cork life preservers. And he ran the whole thing, all the way to the Gulf of California, and completed the survey. The railroad was never built, thank God. And the cave kept his name. Now, fast forward 45 years, to 1934, when a boatman from Utah named Bus Hatch, the founder of a rafting family that is still running the river today, came through Marble Canyon and climbed up into Stanton's Cave to have a look around. And in the dry dust of the cave floor, he found little animal figures. They're small, a few inches, and they are made in a way that, once you understand it, is genuinely ingenious. You take a single long willow twig, soaked until it's supple. You split it lengthwise down most of its length, so you have 2 long tails joined at one end. And then you wrap and fold and weave those 2 halves around each other. And out of one continuous piece of wood, with no cutting and no joining, you produce the body and legs and horns of an animal. Bighorn sheep, mostly. Deer. Hatch's party thought they were children's toys, which is a perfectly reasonable first guess. They were not children's toys. Over the following decades, more turned up, and the person who really made sense of them was an archaeologist named Robert C. Euler, who worked in the Hia Canyon for years, and who excavated Stanton's Cave properly in a serious campaign in the 1960s. Between his work and the finds of others, well over 100 figurines came out of that one cave, and hundreds more have now been recorded from something like 30 sites across 4 western states, though the Grand Canyon has the densest concentration. And then they were radiocarbon dated, about 4,000 years old. The published dates from Grand Canyon sites cluster roughly between 4,000, 400 and 3,700 years before the present, with the whole tradition spanning something like a millennium and a half. Let me put that in perspective, because it's easy to let the number slide by. 4,000 years ago is the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. It's Stonehenge, the Sarsen Circle already standing on Salisbury Plain. It's before the Trojan War, before the Iliad, before Rome, before the Buddha, before Confucius, before Christ. And in the Grand Canyon, someone was climbing several hundred feet up a cliff face, in the dark, carrying a bundle of soaked willow twigs. Because here's the part that turns it from an artifact into a story. Look at where these things are found, and what's with them. They're not in living sites. They're not in the fire pits and refuse of camps. They are deep inside caves, in the red wall, high up, in places that are difficult and often frightening to reach, and often well back from the entrance in total darkness. Several of the best documented caves have small stone cairns built inside them, dozens of them, in no discernible pattern, as though each visitor built one, a personal mark, a signature. Many of the figurines have a tiny, separate twig driven through the body, like a spear. Some have been found with pellets of animal dung placed inside the body cavity, the dung of the very animal the figure represents. And in some of these caves, the figurines appear to have been deliberately placed in association with the bones of animals that were already, even then, extinct. In several caves in the canyon, researchers have found the remains of Harrington's mountain goat, a species that vanished from the southwest at the end of the Ice Age, and the archaic offerings seem to have been placed with them on purpose. So try to reconstruct the scene. 4,000 years ago, a small group of hunters, living in a hard, dry country, working with atlatls and stone points, take the trouble to make an image of the animal they need. They pierce it, symbolically, with a spear. They may put a piece of the animal's own body inside it. Then they climb a cliff, enter a cave, walk back into the dark, past the last of the daylight, past the bones of a goat that hasn't existed since their great-great-great-grandparents' time out of mind, and they set the little figure down, and they walk out and leave it there, and it stays there, in perfect dry darkness, for 4,000 years, until a boatman from Utah with a flashlight puts his hand on it. That is what is buried beneath the Grand Canyon, not gold. A willow deer with a twig through its ribs in the dark. We don't know exactly what they meant by it. Hunting magic is the standard interpretation, and it's probably broadly right. An act of asking, or of promising, or of thanking. Some researchers have argued for something closer to totemism, an act about identity and kinship with the animal rather than simply about the hunt. Nobody living knows for certain, and I think it's important to say that plainly rather than to pretend. But notice the shape of it, the deliberate journey into a hard place, the offering left in the deepest part, the dark opening in the rock as the proper address for something sacred. 4,000 years later, men would come down a trail with prayer sticks in their hands to leave them at a spring in the same canyon system. I'm not going to claim those are the same religion. The archaeological record is not that neat, and the Hopi have not asked me to make that argument. But I will say that they are the same instinct in the same rock, and there is something in that continuity that gives me chills every time I think about it. While we're down here in the caves, let me tell you one more thing, because it's the saddest fact in the canyon. Far downstream, Near the western end, there's another cave, Rampart Cave, and in it, for tens of thousands of years, Shasta ground sloths lived and slept and died. Ground sloths are enormous, slow, shaggy animals the size of a small car, and they've been extinct in North America for around 11,000 years. In Rampart Cave, they left behind a deposit of dung, layered like the pages of a book, several feet thick, an unbroken environmental record of what the sloths ate, and therefore of what grew in that landscape, going back tens of thousands of years. It was one of the most extraordinary paleontological archives on the continent. In 1976, it caught fire. Once a deposit like that starts smoldering, you cannot put it out. It burned underground, slowly, for months, while people tried everything: foam, sealing the cave, pumping in inert gas, and a huge portion of the record was destroyed. Tens of thousands of years of information gone in a single accident, in living memory. I mention it because it's a useful corrective to the fantasy of the sealed vault. The canyon does hold astonishing things. They are not guarded. They are fragile, and they are perishable. And some of them have already been lost by simple carelessness, which is a far better argument for protecting the place than any story about mummies ever was. Now, let's come up out of the caves and into the daylight, because between those willow hunters and the modern Hopi, there's a whole civilization to talk about, and its ruins are lying all over the canyon floor in plain sight. About 52 miles below Lee's Ferry, on the north side of the river, there's a place called Nankoweap. It's one of the largest open areas in the eastern canyon, a broad delta where a creek comes in and river trips stop there. And if you climb up from the beach, it's a steep, loose, thigh-burning climb of several hundred feet. You come out on a ledge in the cliff, and set back into the rock face is a row of small stone and mud rooms with neat rectangular doorways, still standing, still roofed in places, looking out over the river and the whole sweep of the canyon. They're granaries, storage rooms, about 1,000 years old. That view is probably the single most photographed thing in the inner canyon, and almost everyone who sees the picture assumes it's a cliff dwelling, a home. It isn't. It's a pantry, deliberately built where floods can't reach it, where rodents can't easily get in, and where the wind blows through and keeps the corn dry. And it's built high partly for security, and partly because that's simply the sensible place to keep a year of your life. Somebody carried the stones up there. Somebody mixed the mortar and carried the water up there. And then, every autumn, somebody carried the harvest up. These are the people archaeologists have long called the ancestral Puebloans, and who for much of the 20th century were called the Anasazi, a word I'm going to avoid, and I'll tell you why. It's a Navajo word, borrowed by early archaeologists, and depending on how it's parsed, it means something like the ancient ones, or the ancient enemies, or the enemy's ancestors. The Hopi have said, repeatedly and patiently, that they don't care for it. Their word is Hisatsanom, the people of long ago, their ancestors, so that's the word I'll use. And the Hisatsanom lived in the Grand Canyon, not on the edges of it, in it. Downstream from Nankoweap, at River Mile 72, there's a wide delta on the north side called Unkar, where the Unkar Creek comes down through a spectacular gorge and spreads a fan of soil out into the sunlight. And that delta, which today looks like a scatter of rock and mesquite, was farmland. Beginning around the year 850, and continuing for something like 350 years. People farmed it, corn, beans, squash, and they built dwellings there, dozens of structures, and archaeologists working there in the late 1960s and early 1970s under Douglas Schwartz mapped the whole sequence of it. And what emerged was a picture of an annual rhythm that is beautifully sensible once you hear it. The inner canyon in winter is mild. Down at the river it rarely freezes hard. The rim, 7,000 or 8,000 feet up, is buried in snow. But in summer the inner canyon becomes an oven, 115, 120 degrees on the sand, while the rim is a cool, green forest of ponderosa pine. So people moved down in the cool season to farm the deltas where the water is, up in the hot season to the rim and the plateau where there's game and piñon, nuts, and shade. The canyon isn't one place. It's a stack of climate zones on top of each other, and a single family, walking, could pass through the ecological equivalent of Mexico to Canada in a day and a half. There's a small pueblo near the mouth of Bright Angel Creek, right down by the river in the very heart of the canyon, occupied in roughly the 11th and early 12th centuries. There are sites on the Tonto platform. There are hundreds, really well over 1,000 recorded archaeological sites inside the park, and estimates of the true number run far higher, because most of that country has never been systematically surveyed, and much of it is nearly impossible to walk. Up on the south rim, near Desert View, there's a small ruin you can visit called Tusayan, built around the year 1185. It's modest, a few rooms, a plaza, a kiva. It was probably occupied for a generation or less. And that date, 1185, is close to the end, because somewhere in the 12th century, and then more sweepingly across the whole Colorado Plateau in the late 13th, people left. The canyon sites go quiet. Unkar empties. The rim sites empty. Across the entire four corners, Mesa Verde, Chaco, the great cliff villages, an entire settled world winds down and moves on within a few generations. And we know a startling amount about why because of a man who was not looking for any of this. His name was Andrew Ellicott Douglas, and he was an astronomer. In the early 20th century, he was working in Arizona, and he was interested in sunspots, specifically whether the sunspot cycle affected the Earth's climate. And it occurred to him that trees might keep the record. A tree in a dry country grows a wide ring in a wet year, and a narrow ring in a dry one. So if you could read enough trees, you'd have a rainfall chart going back centuries. And then he realized something better. The pattern of wide and narrow rings in any given stretch of decades is essentially a barcode, a unique signature. So you can take a beam from an old building, match its barcode to the overlapping portion of a living tree's record, and chain them together, backward, one timber at a time. It took him more than 20 years. He had a floating sequence from ruins that he couldn't connect to the anchored sequence from living trees. A gap of unknown length, maddening, right in the middle. And in 1929, in Show Low, Arizona, his team pulled a charred beam out of the ground, catalogued wonderfully as HH39, and it bridged the gap. And in that moment, the entire archaeology of the American Southwest acquired exact dates. Not layers, not guesses, years. You could now say that a particular roof beam at a particular ruin was cut in the spring of a particular year, 700 years ago. And the rings told a climate story. They showed, among other things, a severe and prolonged drought across the Colorado Plateau in the last quarter of the 13th century. The Great Drought, roughly 1276 to 1299, sitting on top of a longer-term cooling and a pattern of failing summer rains. Now, modern archaeologists will tell you correctly that drought alone doesn't explain a migration like that. These were people who had farmed marginal land for 1,000 years. They knew about dry spells. The current picture involves a whole tangle of causes. Environmental stress, yes, but also population pressure, soil exhaustion, social and religious upheaval, evidence of violence in some areas, and, crucially, the pull of somewhere better. Down south, along the Rio Grande, and out on the Hopi and Zuni mesas, there was more reliable water and existing communities. But here is the thing that gets said wrong constantly, in documentaries and articles and captions, and it is worth being very firm about. They did not vanish. There is no mystery of the disappearing cliff dwellers. There are no lost people. The Hisatsinom moved over generations, and they arrived at the places their descendants live now. When a Hopi person from Songupavi looks at a ruin at Unkar Delta or a granary at Nankowip, they are not looking at an enigma left by a vanished race. They're looking at a house their family used to live in. And this is where the Hopi understanding of migration becomes, I think, one of the most quietly powerful ideas in the world. Remember the covenant at the emergence. Maasah gave the people the planting stick and the seeds and the water, and told them that before they could settle at the center, they had to complete their migrations. And so, the clans went out, and this is the crucial part, deliberately, in all four directions, to the ends of the land, some going as far as the great waters, and then turning and spiraling back inward. That's what the spiral means, incidentally, when you see it pecked into a rock face out here. Those aren't decoration. Among Hopi people, they're widely understood as migration symbols, the long outward journey and the long return. And along the way, the clans left marks, deliberately. Villages, potsherds, petroglyphs, shrines, footprints in the most literal sense. The Hopi word for this is kukveni, footprints, and the concept is one that the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, for decades, under a director named Lee Kuwanwisaoma, who has explained this in more public settings than I can count, has put at the center of how the tribe engages with archaeology. The idea is this: the ruins are not abandoned. They were left on purpose as evidence. They are the record of a covenant kept, proof that the clans did what they were told to do, that they went out and came back. They mark the land as Hopi land, not in a legal sense, but in a relational one. We were here. We did this properly, and the footprints prove it. So when an archaeologist excavates a site on the Colorado Plateau, from the Hopi point of view, they are not opening a mystery. They are handling a family's deliberately posted signature. And when somebody proposes to put a tramway or a mine or a highway across that country, well, we'll get there. Which brings us to the moment the outside world arrives, and everything begins to complicate. And it begins, as so many things in this part of the world begin, with a group of extremely tired Spaniards looking for gold. In the summer of 1540, an expedition under Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was working its way north through what is now New Mexico and Arizona, looking for cities of gold that did not exist. They had already taken the Zuni town of Hawiku and found it to be a village of stone and mud rather than a treasury. And Coronado, who had staked an enormous fortune on this, was in a difficult mood. He heard about a province to the northwest called Tusayan, and he sent a captain named Pedro de Tovar to look at it with a small party. Tovar and his men became the first Europeans to see the Hopi villages. It did not go well. There was a confrontation, and a brief and ugly skirmish, and then an accommodation of sorts. And while he was there, Tovar heard about something else, a great river further west, very large, some days away. So Coronado sent another captain, Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, with about a dozen men and Hopi guides, to find it. They walked for around 20 days across the pinyon and juniper country. And then the ground opened. We don't know precisely where they stood. Somewhere on the south rim in the eastern part of the canyon, probably in the country between Desert View and Moran Point. But we know what happened next, because the expedition's chronicler Pedro de Castañeda wrote it down. They looked down and saw the river, and they could not comprehend the scale. From the rim, the Colorado looks like a thread. The guides told them it was a very large river. The Spaniards did not believe it. They spent 3 days walking the rim, looking for a way down to water. They were, remember, in high desert with no reliable springs anywhere near the edge. And on the 3rd day, 3 of them, 2 of whom Castañeda names as Pablo de Melgosa and Juan Galeras, made a serious attempt to climb down. They came back late in the day, exhausted, having got perhaps a third of the way. And they said something that has been quoted ever since, because it's such a precise expression of what the canyon does to your eye. The rocks that had looked from the rim about the height of a man turned out when you reached them to be taller than the great tower of the Cathedral of Seville. And they never reached the water. They turned around because it was hopeless, and Cardenas took his men and left. Now, pause here with me for a moment, because there's a question buried in this that I find genuinely delicious. The Hopi guides knew how to get down there. Of course they did. Their people had been going down into that canyon for centuries, for salt, for pilgrimage, for the confluence. There were routes. There are still routes. The salt trail existed. And this party of armed strangers who had just been fighting at Hopi villages spent 3 days on the rim looking for a way down, and did not find one, and eventually gave up and went away. Now, we don't have a Hopi account of that expedition from 1540, so I can't tell you what those guides were thinking. It's possible they genuinely didn't know that stretch of rim. It's entirely possible. But historians have noticed the pattern, because it repeats. Again and again in the Southwest, native guides took Spanish parties to places, and the places turned out to be less useful than expected, and the water was not where it should have been. And then something extraordinary happens, or rather, doesn't. Having been found by Europeans in 1540, the Grand Canyon was then almost completely ignored by them for 235 years. Think about that. In the same span of time, Europeans crossed and recrossed the Atlantic thousands of times, colonized the eastern seaboard, fought 6 wars over it, and founded the United States. And nobody with a pen went back to look at the largest canyon on the continent. The next European to make a real appearance was a Franciscan named Francisco Tomás Garcés in 1776, and he is one of my favorite figures in the whole story, because he seems to have been an unusually decent man in an indecent enterprise. He traveled essentially alone, on foot and by mule, with a few native companions, over vast distances. He was liked by people who had every reason not to like a Spanish priest. In June of 1776, he came down into Havasu Canyon, a side canyon of the Grand Canyon with a blue-green creek running through it, and waterfalls that fall into travertine pools. And he stayed several days with the Havasupai, the people of the blue-green water, who have lived there continuously and who still live there today, in the village of Supai, which remains one of the most remote inhabited places in the United States, reachable only by an 8-mile trail, by helicopter, or by mule. Their mail, famously, still goes in by mule train. Then Garces went east, and on the 4th of July, 1776, while a group of men in Philadelphia were signing a document he would never hear about, he walked into Oraivi, and the Hopi refused him, politely, firmly, completely. Nobody would take him in. He sat down in the street with his blanket, and wrote in his diary, and was ignored, and the next day he gave up and left. I love that image. The Hopi had, by then, more than 2 centuries of experience with Spanish missionaries, including a period in the 1600s when missions were established in their villages, and their religion was actively suppressed. In 1680, the Pueblo Revolt swept the Spanish out of the entire region, and at the Hopi village of Awatovi, some years later, the community was destroyed in a violent internal reckoning tied to the return of Christianity. That is a heavy and painful history that Hopi people discuss carefully among themselves, and it isn't mine to unpack. But its consequence for a lone friar in 1776 was simple. The answer was no, and the answer stayed no. The Hopi never did get missionized in the way their neighbors did. They never were conquered outright. They kept the villages, they kept the ceremonies, and they kept the calendar. And that is precisely why we can still talk tonight about a living tradition of emergence and pilgrimage, rather than a reconstructed one. Which brings us to the man who put the canyon on the American map. On the 24th of May, 1869, at Green River Station in Wyoming Territory, 4 wooden boats pushed off into the current with 10 men aboard. Their leader was John Wesley Powell, a self-taught naturalist, a Methodist preacher's son, a fervent abolitionist, and a major of artillery, who had lost most of his right arm to a Confederate Minié ball at Shiloh in April of 1862. He had gone back to the war afterward. He was 35 years old, and he intended to run the entire unexplored length of the Green and Colorado rivers, through country that was genuinely, on the maps of the day, a blank. It went badly, almost immediately. They lost a boat and a third of their supplies in the first month. The food spoiled. The men were on short rations of flour and rancid bacon and coffee for weeks. One man quit early and walked out. And on the 13th of August, they arrived at the head of the Grand Canyon proper, and Powell wrote an entry in his journal that people have been quoting ever since. He described being about to go down into what he called the Great Unknown. He wrote about the river swelling, and the walls closing in above them, and the fact that they did not know what lay ahead. He was aware that they might be about to run into a waterfall they could not portage, in a gorge they could not climb out of, with no food. For 2 weeks they fought down it. Rapids, portages, rain, hunger. And on the 28th of August, near the western end, 3 men had had enough. Oramo Howland, his brother Seneca Howland, and William Dunn announced they were leaving. They were convinced the next rapid was unrunnable and that continuing was suicide. Powell was equally convinced that climbing out into that desert country was suicide. They argued through the night. In the morning, the 3 men climbed out. The remaining 6 ran the rapid, which is now called Separation Rapid, and it turned out to be survivable. And within a day or 2, they were out of the canyon and into calm water, and they had done it. The 3 who left were never seen again. What happened to them has been argued about for 150 years. The account Powell received and repeated was that they were killed by Shivwits Paiutes, who mistook them for other men who had committed a murder. Later, writers have suggested other possibilities, including that they were killed by Mormon settlers. And there are letters and rumors and a great deal of speculation, and there is no consensus, and there probably never will be. I'd rather leave it honestly unresolved than pretend otherwise. Powell went back in 1871 with a better-equipped expedition, and this time with proper surveying, and the maps got made. He became one of the most powerful scientific administrators in the country, the founder of the Bureau of Ethnology in 1879, later the director of the U.S. Geological Survey. And he wrote a report in 1878 on the lands of the arid region that told the United States government in essence that the West did not have enough water to be settled the way the East had been, and that the whole homestead model would fail out there. He was right. He was comprehensively ignored. And it's Powell's Bureau of Ethnology that brings us to the next chapter, because the same institutional impulse that mapped the canyon also decided to map the people. And that is where this story turns genuinely uncomfortable. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, a certain kind of American scholar arrived on the Hopi mesas with notebooks. They came out of a genuine intellectual conviction that has to be understood on its own terms, even where it was wrong. The conviction was that Native American cultures were dying, that within a generation or 2 they would be gone, and that the urgent duty of science was to write everything down before it vanished. It was called salvage ethnography. It produced an enormous body of documentation, and much of it is extraordinary, and quite a lot of it was gathered in ways that ranged from insensitive to outright theft. One of the first was a Scot named Alexander MacGregor Stephen, who came out to the Hopi country and settled near First Mesa, and lived there for years, learning the language and taking notes obsessively, day after day, on everything: ceremonies, songs, kinship, farming, weather, gossip, until his death in 1894. His notes were eventually published in the 1930s as the Hopi Journal, edited by the anthropologist Elsie Clews Parsons, and they run to well over 1,000 pages of raw daily observation. As a record of a community at a moment in time, there's very little in world ethnography to compare with it. Then there was Jesse Walter Fuchs, of Powell's Bureau of American Ethnology, who in 1895 excavated an abandoned village on First Mesa called Sikyatki, a Hopi ancestral site that had been ruined long before. In a story Hopi people tell about a conflict between villages, and what came out of the ground at Sikyatki was pottery. Yellow-orange ware with astonishing painted designs, birds and feathers and abstract curves, sophisticated in a way that stopped people in their tracks. And here the story does something wonderful. A Hopi Tewa woman from the village of Hano on First Mesa, named Nampeo, saw those excavated sherds. She was already a potter, and by all accounts an unusually gifted one. and she began studying the old designs, not copying them exactly, but absorbing the vocabulary, the sense of how a curve should sit on a curved surface, and she started making pottery in that idiom. Her husband, Lesueur, is said to have brought her sherds from the digs. The result revolutionized Pueblo pottery. Nampeyo became, by some distance, the most famous Native American potter of her era. Her work is in museums everywhere. Her descendants are still making pots on First Mesa today, 5 and 6 generations on. That's what handing back a footprint can do. A pile of broken pieces went into the light, and a living woman turned it back into something alive. And then there was H.R. Voth. Heinrich Voth was a Mennonite missionary who arrived at Arrivie in 1893 and stayed for years. He learned Hopi. He documented the ceremonies in extraordinary detail, the snake dance, the Powamu, the winter solstice observances, and he published those descriptions with the photographs and diagrams of altars through the Field Museum in Chicago in the early 1900s. And the Hopi memory of him is not fond. The accusation, which has been made publicly by Hopi people many times, is that Voth entered kivas where he had no business being, that he photographed and described things that were restricted, that he removed or acquired ceremonial objects, and that when he was asked to stop, he did not. Some accounts say he had to be physically removed from ceremonies and simply returned. Now, if you want the full weight of why that matters, remember what we said earlier. In Hopi practice, sacred knowledge is not a book. It is a possession held by particular people in particular societies, released at particular times, and its power is bound up with its restriction. So publishing it isn't equivalent to publishing a hymn. It's closer to breaking something. And here we arrive at the deep irony under this entire episode, and I want to say it slowly, because it's the thesis of the whole night. The outside world has spent well over a century obsessed with the idea that there is a hidden secret beneath the Grand Canyon that somebody is keeping from us. And, in the same period, the actual sacred knowledge of the actual people of that canyon was taken from them, printed, photographed, catalogued, exhibited, and sold, precisely because nobody was willing to accept that some things are not ours to have. The fantasy is that the truth is being withheld. The history is that it was extracted. And the strain of all this, missionaries, ethnographers, federal agents, and above everything else, the government's campaign to take Hopi children away to boarding schools where they were forbidden their own language, put an unbearable pressure on the villages. Arrivie, the oldest of them, split apart under it. The division was between those who believed some accommodation with the American government was necessary, led by the village chief Tawaquaptewa, and those who refused any of it, led by a man named Ukiuma. It had been building for years, and in early September of 1906 it came to a head, and the way they resolved it is the most Hopi thing in this entire history. They did not fight with weapons. A line was scratched on the ground, and the two factions gathered on either side, and it became a pushing contest. A mass of people shoving against a mass of people, with the agreement that whichever side was pushed back over the line would leave the village. Ukiuma's side lost, and they honored it. They walked out that same day with what they could carry, and founded a new village a few miles away at Hotevilla, and on a rock out there, someone carved a line of English words recording the agreement and the date, the 8th of September, 1906. It's still there. You can read it. a treaty scratched into a stone by people who had just lost their home and kept their word anyway. The aftermath was brutal. Federal troops involved, men imprisoned, children seized for school, a village founded in winter with no stored corn. Yukiuma was jailed repeatedly, and at one point was taken to Washington and met the president. And Orive, which had been the largest and oldest Hopi village, never recovered its size. Much of it stands empty today. Now hold that image, a people who have had things taken from them by publication, and let's talk about 1963. That was the year Book of the Hopi came out, written by Frank Waters with Oswald Whitebear Fredericks, and it did something nobody involved could have predicted. It made Hopi prophecy an international commodity. The book laid out the four worlds, and it laid out a set of prophecies about the end of this one, signs to watch for, a purification to come. And it landed in the middle of the 1960s, in a culture primed for exactly that, and it never stopped selling. For 60 years now, Hopi prophecy has been a fixture of a certain kind of bookshelf, and a certain kind of lecture circuit, and eventually a certain kind of website. Some of what grew out of it was sincere. A Hopi man named Thomas Banyatsia, who was designated as one of a small number of interpreters charged with carrying a warning message to the outside world, spent decades trying to be heard by governments, and in December of 1992, he finally addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. He talked about the land, about water, about the consequences of taking more than you return. Whatever you make of the framework, he was, by every account, a man of complete personal integrity, doing something he believed he had been told to do. And some of what grew out of it was not sincere at all. There is a whole cottage industry of people claiming to speak as Hopi elders who are not authorized to speak for anyone, distributing prophecies of varying invention, and the Hopi tribe has had to issue public statements about it more than once. The Cultural Preservation Office has spent years explaining, patiently to an audience that mostly doesn't want to hear it, that the tribe does not send out messengers with prophecies, that individuals do not speak for the villages, and that a great deal of what circulates under the Hopi name has nothing to do with them. And you can see, can't you, how all of this sets the table. By the last decades of the 20th century, the culture had built an enormous appetite for the idea of secret ancient knowledge in the American Southwest, connected to lost worlds, suppressed by authorities. And into that appetite, someone dropped a scan of a 115-year-old front page from a Phoenix evening paper. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. It had the canyon. It had the mummies. It had the government cover-up. And this is the part that always gets me. It even had the same underlying shape as the real tradition. A hidden world beneath the canyon that the authorities don't want you to know about. Except the real one is not hidden by a government. It's protected by a people. And it's not a rumor, it's a religion. And it's not in a locked cave, it's under your feet, and it always was. So let's come all the way forward now, into the last few decades, because the question of what lies beneath the Grand Canyon stopped being a matter of legend and became, quite suddenly, a matter of law. In 1990, the United States Congress passed something called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. What it did, in essence, was establish that ancestral human remains and certain sacred and funerary objects held in museums and federal collections are not specimens. They belong to descendant communities, and those communities can ask for them back. And it landed like an earthquake on American archaeology, because the scale of what was sitting in storage was staggering. The accumulated collecting of a century and a half. Tens of thousands of individuals, boxed and catalogued in institutions all over the country. The Hopi position, expressed through their Cultural Preservation Office over the following decades, has been consistent and has often surprised people. It is not primarily about acquiring things. It's about stopping the disturbance. Where ancestors have been taken, they should be returned and reburied. Where ancestors are still in the ground, the strong preference is that they be left exactly where they are. Because a burial is not an artifact awaiting study. It's a person completing a journey. When a site must be disturbed for a road or a pipeline, the tribe's involvement is often about minimizing and mitigating rather than collecting. Think about how that sits against the fantasy we started with. The 1909 story imagines a chamber of hundreds of mummies and treats that as the ultimate prize, the thing every archaeologist would kill to open. The people whose ancestors actually are buried in that canyon have spent 30 years asking, in formal legal language, for people to stop opening things. And then, at almost exactly the same time, came the fight over the confluence. Here's the setting, where the turquoise Little Colorado joins the green-brown Colorado. At the bottom of a gorge 3,000 feet deep is one of the most sacred locations in the Southwest, and not just to one people. To the Hopi, it's the approach to the Sipapuni, the place of emergence. To the Zuni, that region is bound up with their own origin and migration history. To the Navajo, whose reservation includes the eastern rim above it, the confluence is a sacred place, associated with their own accounts of the world's beginnings. To the Hualapai and others, it's part of a shared ancestral landscape. It is, at present, one of the hardest places in the lower 48 states to reach. You can get there by boat on a multi-day river trip. Or you can walk in on a route that drops several thousand feet from the rim over many miles of rough country. That's it. And, beginning around 2009, a group of developers began pushing a proposal to the Navajo Nation for something called Grand Canyon Escalade. The plan was substantial. A 420-acre resort development on the East Rim, hotel, restaurants, RV park, shops, and then the centerpiece, a gondola tramway a mile and a half long, dropping visitors from the rim to the canyon floor at the confluence, up to 10,000 people a day. At the bottom, an elevated walkway out over the rivers, an amphitheater and a restaurant. 10,000 people a day at the mouth of the emergence. The pitch was jobs and revenue in a region with real and grinding poverty, and I want to be fair about that, because it was not a frivolous argument and there were Navajo people who supported it for entirely serious reasons. Unemployment on that part of the reservation is severe. Money matters. But the opposition was something remarkable. A group of Navajo families who lived near the rim, people whose grazing lands and homes were in the footprint of the project, organized as Save the Confluence, and they fought it for years, chapter house by chapter house, resolution by resolution. They gathered signatures and testimony and support from Navajo communities across the nation. And then something happened that historians of the region will be writing about for a long time. The tribes lined up together, Hopi, Zuni, Navajo, Hualapai, and others, nations with their own long and complicated histories with one another, histories that include real grievance, set that aside and presented a common front on the confluence. Hopi leaders traveled to Window Rock to testify at Navajo Nation Council hearings. Statements were entered arguing that development at that place would cause irreversible harm to its sacred qualities. The bill went through committee after committee and lost in each one. And on the 31st of October, 2017, in a special session of the Navajo Nation Council at Window Rock, it came to a final vote. 16 against, 2 in favor. There are accounts of people weeping in the chamber afterward. 7 years of fear ended in an afternoon. And here's what I want you to notice about that vote, because it's the whole point of tonight in a single event. A proposal to build a machine that would deliver 10,000 people a day to the door of the underworld was stopped, not by a government agency, not by an environmental lawsuit, but by indigenous nations acting together, and by a handful of families who live on that rim and refused to move. The story about the Grand Canyon's hidden underground truth is usually told as a story about secrecy. It's actually a story about defense, and the defending hasn't stopped because the pressure hasn't. Since the Escalade fight, there have been repeated proposals for pumped storage hydropower projects in the Little Colorado Gorge, dams and reservoirs in that same stretch of blue water, and they have drawn immediate unified opposition from Hopi and Navajo leaders, and from conservation groups, and by most accounts, regulators have turned away several of them. But they keep coming back in new corporate wrappers, because the physics of that gorge is attractive to anyone with a spreadsheet. And then there's uranium. The plateau country around the Grand Canyon is riddled with what geologists call breccia pipes, vertical, collapsed columns of broken rock, sometimes a few 100 feet across, that go down through the layers like chimneys, and some of them are extraordinarily rich in uranium. The mining history here is genuinely grim. The old Orphan Mine sat right on the south rim inside the national park, producing uranium into the 1960s, and left contamination that has cost a fortune and decades to deal with. Across the wider Colorado Plateau, uranium mining left the Navajo Nation with hundreds of abandoned mines and a legacy of illness that families are still living with, in some cases 3 generations on. South of the park, near a place the Havasupai call Wii-Gudwisa, Red Butte, a mine has been the focus of a long fight. Red Butte is a traditional cultural property, a place of central religious importance to the Havasupai, and the mine sits close by, over the aquifer that feeds the springs of Havasu Canyon, the blue-green water that the Havasupai are named for, and that their entire village depends on. In 2012, the federal government put a 20-year hold on new mining claims across about 1 million acres around the canyon. 20 years, though, is 20 years. It expires. Which brings us to the 8th of August, 2023. On that day, on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, the President of the United States signed a proclamation establishing a new national monument of 917,618 acres in 3 sections, north and south of the park, and it made that mining withdrawal permanent. But it's the name I want to leave with you. The monument is called Baj Nuavjo Ita Kukveni, Ancestral Footprints of the Grand Canyon. Baj Nuavjo is Havasupai. It means, roughly, where indigenous peoples roam. Ita Kukveni is Hopi. It means our ancestral footprints. Kukveni, footprints. The same word we met earlier, the idea that the ruins and the sherds and the petroglyphs across that whole country were deliberately left as a record of a covenant kept. A coalition of tribal nations, Havasupai, Hopi, Hualapai, Navajo, Zunaic, several Paiute nations, Yavapai Apache, and others, spent years pushing for that designation, and when they finally got to choose what it was called, they did not name it after a president or a senator or a geologist or a mountain. They named it Footprints, which is to say, this is not empty land, and it never was, and the proof is lying on the ground in front of you. There has been litigation since. There is always litigation. A challenge to the monument was dismissed in federal court, and the arguments about mining and access and management will go on for as long as there is uranium under that plateau and a market for it. Nothing out there is permanently settled. It never has been. But the map has changed. The names on it now include Hopi words and Havasupai words, and they were chosen by the people whose words they are. Clarence Dutton, in 1882, looked at those buttes and reached for Shiva and Vishnu and Isis because they were the grandest words he could think of. He meant it as reverence, and in his way it was, but he was naming somebody else's home in a language nobody there spoke. 140 years later, the naming came back around. Now, I've been telling you a Hopi story tonight, because that's what the title asks for. But I'd be doing the canyon a disservice if I let you think the Hopi are the only people whose history is down there. 11 tribes are formally recognized as traditionally associated with Grand Canyon National Park, and each of them has its own account, its own roots, its own places. The Hualapai, whose reservation runs along 100 miles of the south side of the Western Canyon. The Southern Paiute bands on the north. The Navajo on the east. The Zuni, whose own origin history is bound to that same river corridor. The Yavapai Apache to the south. And the Havasupai, Havasu Baja, the people of the blue-green water, who live inside the canyon. Let me tell you what happened to them, because it's short, and it will stay with you. The Havasupai lived historically in a seasonal round across an enormous area, farming the well-watered side canyons in the warm months, and moving up onto the plateau, hunting, gathering pinyon, using the forests and springs of what's now the South Rim country in the cold months. Estimates of the land they used run to well over 1 million acres. In 1880, under pressure from miners, the federal government drew them a reservation. Through a combination of incompetence and indifference, the boundaries ended up enclosing about 518 acres. 518. A little under a square mile, at the bottom of a canyon, for an entire people who had ranged over a territory the size of a small state. Everything else, the plateau, the winter camps, the springs, was simply taken. And then, in 1919, the Grand Canyon became a national park, and the pressure tightened again. There were Havasupai families still living and farming along the Bright Angel Trail, at a green place halfway down the canyon with springs and cottonwoods, which they called Ha'agyo, roughly the place where the cottonwoods grow. It's the best water in that part of the canyon, which is why it was farmed, and it's also why the Park Service wanted it, because it was the obvious place to put a rest stop for tourists coming down the trail. The families were pushed out, and in 1928, the last Havasupai man living there, a farmer known as Captain Burrow, was forcibly removed. The Park Service renamed the place Indian Garden. Now, that's the sad part. And if this were most stories, it would end there. It doesn't. In 1975, after decades of organizing and lobbying, Congress passed an act that returned roughly 188,000 acres of plateau land to the Havasupai, the largest such return to any tribe at that time. It didn't undo 1880, but it was real, and it happened because Havasupai people, most of whom had very little money and no political power at all, refused to stop asking. And then, in 2022, the Havasupai Tribal Council passed a resolution formally requesting that the National Park Service change the name of that green place halfway down the trail. The Park Service submitted it, and in November of that year, the United States Board on Geographic Names, the same body that in 1906 had made Shiva Temple official, voted 19-0. Indian Garden became Havasupai Gardens, and in May of the following year, the descendants of Captain Burrow walked down that trail to hold a ceremony there. His family, generations back, had changed their surname to Telusi, a word that means storyteller. His descendants are still there. They still tell it. About 100,000 people a year walk past that spot on their way down the Bright Angel Trail. Most of them stop and fill their water bottles and sit under those cottonwoods and look up at the walls. And now the sign tells them whose garden it was. That's what it looks like in practice when the buried thing comes back up. Not a vault of gold. A name restored on a signpost by a 19-0 vote. 94 years after a man was marched out of his own field. There's one more piece of the Hopi world I want to give you before we start winding down, because without it, the picture is incomplete, and because it's the part that turns the whole thing from a story about the past into a description of how the world works right now, this year, this summer. Remember what the sorcerer showed them through the opening. The dead go down, they live below, and they come back as rain. In Hopi understanding, the dead become associated with the clouds, and the clouds are bound up with the Katsinam, the spirit beings who are at the center of Hopi religious life. There are hundreds of them, each with a name and a character and a role. And they are not gods exactly, and not ancestors exactly. They occupy a category that English doesn't really have a word for. They are the spirits of things, of rain, of certain animals and plants, of the dead, of the powers that make the world function. And they have an address. For much of the year they live on the San Francisco peaks, Nuvatukya Ovi, the place of snow on the very top, the great volcanic massif that rises above Flagstaff, visible from the Hopi mesas as a blue shape on the southwestern horizon, catching the first snow of the year and the last. The ceremonial calendar tracks their movement. Around the winter solstice, at the soil ceremony, the Katsinam come to the villages, and they stay through the growing season, present in ceremony, taking part in the life of the community, until the Naiman ceremony in July, the home dance, when they are sent back to the peaks, carrying the people's prayers with them. And then, the clouds build over those peaks in the afternoon heat, and drift out over the mesas and break, and the corn drinks. So look at the geometry of that. It's a circuit. The dead go down through the opening in the canyon, into the world below. From below, they rise as moisture. They gather on the sacred peak in the west. They come to the villages as Katsinam, and as clouds, and as rain. The rain grows the corn feeds the people. The people, when they die, go back down through the canyon, and every element of it is a physical place you could visit. The dome on the Little Colorado, the peaks above Flagstaff, the fields below the mesas. That's not a myth in the sense of a story people tell. It's a working model of a watershed, expressed in the language of kinship. It says, the water that keeps you alive is your family, and you owe it something. And it is precisely why the fights we talked about are fought so hard. When someone proposes a tram at the confluence, or a mine over the aquifer, or, as has happened and been litigated all the way up through the federal courts, the making of artificial snow on the San Francisco peaks from treated wastewater, the response from the tribes is not an aesthetic objection. It's closer to what you'd feel if someone proposed to run a pipeline through your parents' graves and then explain that it would create jobs. I'm not asking you to adopt anyone's religion tonight. I'm asking you to notice that this one is a coherent, functioning, extremely old description of how life persists in a desert, and that the people who hold it have been holding it on those three mesas, without interruption, since before the Magna Carta. Now, before we let all this drift, I want to give you one last thing, because it's my favorite fact in the entire canyon, and it's a good one to fall asleep on. We've spent the night talking about what's buried beneath the Grand Canyon. Here's a harder question. How old is the hole? You would think of all the things about this place that would be settled. It is not. It is one of the longest-running, most genuinely unresolved arguments in American geology. The traditional answer is about 5 or 6 million years. That's based on solid evidence. The Colorado River appears to have reached the Gulf of California around 5.5 million years ago, and there's no sign of the river's sediment arriving at the Gulf before that. Cut the canyon after that, and everything fits. But then, starting in the 1980s and accelerating with new techniques in the 2000s, another line of evidence turned up. Researchers began using thermochronology, measuring, essentially, how long ago a particular mineral grain cooled down as the rock above it was stripped away, by looking at helium accumulating from radioactive decay in crystals of apatite. It's an extraordinary technique. It lets you read the erosion history of a landscape out of individual sand grain-sized crystals, and some of those results came back saying that parts of the Grand Canyon, particular segments of it, were carved to something near their present depth tens of millions of years ago, 50, perhaps 70, which cannot both be true, and set off a scientific argument that got genuinely heated, with serious people on both sides publishing in the best journals and, occasionally, being rather rude about each other in print. The picture that's emerged more recently is a compromise, and it's much more interesting than either extreme. The Grand Canyon may not be one canyon at all. It may be several old canyon segments, some very old indeed, carved by earlier rivers running in different directions, that were later connected up and deepened by the modern Colorado when it finally punched through and integrated the whole system a few million years ago. In other words, the canyon has a lineage. It was assembled out of older canyons, and that idea should feel familiar, because it's the same shape as everything else we've talked about tonight. Worlds beneath worlds, older versions underneath, still present, still structuring what's on top. The geologists arrived at that by measuring helium in crystals, and the Hopi arrived at something rhyming with it by other means entirely, and I don't think either one proves the other. But I do find it beautiful that the deepest scientific answer we have about that canyon is, it's older than it looks, and there's more than one of it. And the one you can see is standing on the ones you can't. So let's gather it all up now, slowly, and then let it go. We started on a rim in the dark, with a cool wind coming up out of a mile of nothing. We went into a newspaper office in Phoenix in April of 1909 and found a story about copper weapons and hieroglyphs and a seated figure holding a lotus, and we followed that story out into the world and watched it grow for 115 years on the strength of two men who appear never to have existed. We met Clarence Dutton, standing on the North Rim in the 1880s with a cigar and a theology degree, reaching for the names of gods because ordinary words weren't big enough, and accidentally seeding a conspiracy theory that would outlive him by more than a century. We climbed to the top of Shiva Temple with a party of New York scientists and found a photographer's empty film box waiting for them. We went down to a dome of yellow travertine on a turquoise river, where the Hopi say their ancestors climbed up out of a drowned world on a reed, and where a figure called Masa met them with a short blue ear of corn and told them the terms: "Be humble, take care of it, finish your migrations." We walked in the dark into the back of a limestone cave 4,000 years ago, with a willow deer in our hands. We watched a people push each other across a line scratched in the dirt at Oreva in September of 1906 rather than raise a weapon, and we watched the losing side keep their word and walk away and build a new village. We stood in the council chamber at Window Rock on the 31st of October, 2017, and heard a vote go 16-2. And we watched a name come back to a garden halfway down the Bright Angel Trail, 94 years late. So what is still buried beneath the Grand Canyon? Not Egyptians, not a vault, not a secret being kept from you by anyone in Washington. What's down there is a world that a living people say is the one they came from, and the one they'll return to. What's down there is a road with shrines along it, that men have walked for centuries with feathers in their hands. What's down there is a willow figurine in a dark cave, and a granary of 1,000-year-old corn on a ledge above the river, and 1 billion missing years between 2 layers of rock, and a family's house at Unkar Delta, and the ashes of a people's own long argument about how to live. And what's down there, in the end, is a covenant, the idea that you may live here, on this hard, beautiful earth, on the condition that you look after it and remember where you came from, and that if you forget, the world ends and you'll have to start again somewhere below. Which is, I think, why the fake story never satisfied anyone, and never will. The fake story is about finding. It imagines the canyon as a container with something valuable inside it, waiting for the right person with the right flashlight. The real story is about keeping. It imagines the canyon as a relationship you're already in, whether you know it or not. And there's no digging required. That's the thing. There's no cave you need to find. The Hopi have been standing on the mesas saying it out loud in English to journalists and to Congress and to anyone who'll sit still for over 100 years. You just have to be the kind of person who can hear an answer that isn't the one they came for. Now, let all of it go. Let the mummies go. They were never there. Let the newspaper go, and the 2 men with the shifting spellings, and the forbidden zone that isn't forbidden. Let the arguments about helium and apatite crystals go. Let the names go, all of them. Kincaid and Dutton and Powell and Nampeo and Yukiuma and Captain Burrow. All those people who wanted so badly to be understood, and who mostly weren't. You don't need to hold on to any of it. It'll be here. Just keep one picture, if you keep anything. Somewhere east of here, right now, in the dark, at the bottom of a gorge 3,000 feet deep, there's a small dome of yellow stone on a riverbank. There's no road to it. There's nobody standing there. There's a pool of mineral water in the top of it, and every so often the surface stirs very gently as the earth breathes out. It's been doing that all night. It'll be doing it in the morning. Sleep well.